Hi guys. We'll start with the intro to landscape ecology. This is largely based on chapter 1 in Wyth's book. I'm assuming most of you probably hadn't had the opportunity to get the book yet. I'll post a link. You can actually access chapter 1 online. So I'll make sure and post a link so you can access this chapter. And let me know if you have any questions about that. So we'll talk today a little bit about just the background in landscape ecology, where the discipline came from, the difference between the North American view of landscape ecology and the European view. But why study this discipline? Why do we even have this discipline? And as you all know, life on Earth may have begun 3.5 billion years ago, but vertebrates have only been part of that story for about 500 million years, and humans are just a blip on that radar with just 165,000 years of presence on Earth, but a profound impact. So landscape ecology is really a response discipline to understand the interactions between humans and ecological systems. As human population grows, our need for land and our mass consumption of resources have had profound influences on ecological systems. I'm not telling you anything you don't already know, I'm sure. So some of the principles of landscape ecology, and this is more the North American perspective, is the effect of human land use on landscapes, past, present, future. So we think about this on broad spatial scales often and on broad temporal scales. All landscapes are heterogeneous, and they make up a variety of landforms, ecosystems, communities, land uses that reflect different processes, physical, biological, anthropogenic, that have shaped them. So the flow of materials, nutrients, and organisms across the landscape are all important for the maintenance and ecological functions that contribute to the diversity and structure within those landscapes. A definition that has persisted for North America is that landscape ecology is the study of the reciprocal effects of pattern and process. And it's kind of nice to think about the simplicity of that definition. It should not necessarily be scale dependent, and although we often think of landscape ecology at broad spatial scales, there is a push, and has been a persistent push, to recognize that we can think about landscapes at the scale of the organisms that we're considering. Often the organisms that we are considering are humans and the scale at which we interact with the natural world. Implicit in this discipline is the understanding the human modification of landscapes. This is an interesting map from your book that kind of captures the relative human impact globally on natural systems. So we know that humans have had a very long history of interaction with the natural world, but that presence is felt differently across the globe. The book talks a little bit about just the profound impact that we see in North America of indigenous people that reaches back millennia. And it specifically mentions the Mississippian culture that flourished more than 1,000 years ago in river valleys of the southeastern United States, and that transformed floodplain landscapes with the creation of these huge earthen mounds. And so this is a picture actually from Macon, Georgia, of one of those Mississippian earthen mounds. These were just tremendous feats of architecture and effort, really comparable to the pyramids. So one of the largest of these mounds is over 30 meters tall. It covers 6 hectares, and really solely by packing mud and clay together by hand and moving that. So just incredible architecture, and a lasting imprint on the landscape. So this particular mound is part of Ocmulgee National Park in Macon, Georgia. Its inhabitants, the Muskogee Creek Nation, were the designers and engineers of this mound and many others in that area. I've included here a really sort of sweet video of a project that I've had the chance to work on in the past couple of years to secure some of the lands around the Ocmulgee National Park, and to add that to the protected landscape. And I just thought you would be interested in seeing the video that talks about this partnership to secure some of these lands in collaboration with the Muskogee Creek Nation, which of course has been displaced from Macon, Georgia, and is now in Oklahoma. But that tribe and the tribal leaders come down to this area, back to their homeland, and have a strong interest in being part of land protection efforts there. So when we consider which properties to add to this, we're considering often the cultural values. Where do we have important, intact cultural resources that might be important to the tribes, as well as the ecological values of a particular property. So these are concepts of landscape ecology that play out day to day in the realm of land conservation. It's important because we need to decide which parcels are most important, our priorities. So have the ecological connectivity, cultural values that are the greatest, and in order to secure funding for those properties, we need to be able to demonstrate that they're the best. And I hope we'll talk a lot in this class about some of these types of examples, real-world examples of how landscape ecology plays out in the day-to-day. I had another segue I wanted to talk about with this concept of indigenous transformations. And so I'm just going to give you like 2 or 3 minute summary of part of my master's research on the brown-headed cowbird. When I decided to study the brown-headed cowbird in the 90s, the basic understanding was that this was a species that had made its way to the eastern United States, and specifically into the Charleston, South Carolina area where I was studying the bird in the mid-1960s. There was consensus that eastern songbird host species were new, novel hosts of the cowbird egg, and therefore less likely to have defense mechanisms to protect themselves against brown-headed cowbirds, who are brood parasites. So for those of you who don't know this bird, this is a bird that never lays never builds its own nest, but rather lays its eggs in the nest of other songbirds and lets them raise the young for them. And so brown-headed cowbirds were nomadic because they followed buffalo herds and really couldn't be tied down by having a nest. And this is brood parasitism is a behavior that's evolved many times in bird species across the world. So part of my study was to study these defense mechanisms. Do we actually see that some of these eastern hosts respond to cowbirds? And of course, maybe not surprisingly to you guys, they did. There were quite a few defense mechanisms, building second bottoms to the nest and laying an additional clutch of eggs, throwing the cowbird egg out or abandoning the nest, destroying the eggs. So we saw all that in multiple hosts. And the paper that we ended up writing about this, let me share with you guys as well, is basically just laid out the premise that, you know, of course, brown-headed cowbirds had been in the eastern United States before. The myth of the eastern forest, the closed eastern forest, persisted, but what we know is that in the past, indigenous interaction with the land in the eastern United States was such that fire was pervasive. We had prairies in South Carolina, buffalo were present, bison were present here, and certainly cowbirds were present as well. So these eastern hosts had been exposed, and it really had just been a blip in time that we had lost that process in the landscape, and people drew inferences about just the near past and what they saw. So most likely the cowbird had been here, and then its habitat was not here. And then once we started opening up areas for agriculture again and having cattle on the landscape, the cowbirds moved back in. So long-winded example, but an interesting one about temporal changes in pattern and process on the landscape. I want to talk a little bit just about, you know, the fact that really even ecosystem ecology is a relatively new discipline. One of the founders of ecosystem ecology I had the chance to work with when I was a grad student for my master's at University of Georgia. Eugene Odum was considered one of the fathers of modern ecosystem ecology. And Odum spent decades refining and spreading kind of his holistic model of ecosystem ecology. He found a captive audience in the burgeoning, at that time, environmentalist movement. So in many ways, Odum became one of the faces of that movement, and he was a really charismatic and infectious person. I've got a quote here from Eugene Odum that I think really segues well into what we've seen with the intersection of the discipline of landscape ecology and land conservation and conservation biology. So he said, we must begin to devote more of our human wealth, energy, and engineering skills to servicing and repairing our big house, the biosphere, which provides us not only a place to live and enjoy, but also all of our life support needs. So a little bit about the birth of this discipline. You know, when we look at other fields of ecology and such, the landscape ecology has only been around for about 35 years. So relative to other established fields of natural and social sciences, this is really a relatively new one. We often mark the birth of a discipline by the establishment of a professional society or a scholarly journal dedicated to its study. So the International Association for Landscape Ecology was officially founded in October 1982 at an international symposium that was held in Western Slovakia. The formation of the IALE was led by European ecologists and geographers who saw the need for a broader, multidisciplinary science that was concerned with management, planning, and the design of landscapes. In April 1983, 25 ecologists and geographers were invited to a 3-day workshop in Alderton Park, Illinois. And this was really the beginning of the North American sort of brand of landscape ecology. So they were invited to discuss the idea of developing landscape ecology in North America. And that workshop was really represented a pivotal moment in establishing the paradigm of landscape ecology in North America, which focused on the reciprocal effects of landscape pattern and ecological process. You can see from the photo of the folks that gathered that we sort of lacked some diversity in that group of founders. I will mention that in this list is someone that I had the opportunity to work for when I was a grad student at Georgia, who had been Eugene Odom's grad student. A guy named Gary Barrett is on the front row here, and Gary was ended up being a professor at UGA as well. And I had the opportunity to type his emails because he didn't like to type when I was a grad student. So let's talk about what made the world ripe for the advent of landscape ecology. There are a few things that sort of happened simultaneously that really allowed for the birth of this discipline. So one was the establishment of the island biogeography theory by MacArthur and Wilson. I want to talk a little bit about that on the next slide. Metapopulation theories. Another was that there was really a growing recognition of the importance of spatial scaling in the design and interpretation of ecological research, and a shifting view of the thought that ecological systems were closed or isolated and driven towards an equilibrium state to a view that they were open, connected, and dynamic. And so this was supported with field research at the time, and really the still growing field of ecosystem ecology. There were advances in remote sensing and GIS that were essential, advances in computer modeling, and all that intersecting with growing concern over how humans were modifying the environment, especially in those heavily industrialized nations where landscape ecology first originated. I'm guessing that most of you guys have probably been exposed to the theory of island biogeography before, but I think it's worth revisiting because it's one of the important concepts when we think about patch dynamics and movement of organisms, and certainly a seminal paper both in ecology and in landscape ecology. So this theory of island biogeography had its roots in E.O. Wilson's work with ants. Robert MacArthur, who was a collaborator of E.O. Wilson's, really synthesize Wilson's ideas about competition, colonization, equilibrium into this simple geographic representation of immigration and extinction. They decided to do this to build a theory around the state of equilibrium of species diversity on islands. Islands are simpler ecosystems to study and allowed for them to really pursue this this concept. So Wilson's ideas about competition, colonization, and equilibrium, he put in the simple graph with curves that represented immigration and extinction curves. And from that, we can determine the equilibrium of species number on an island. So their ideas were first presented in a paper, and then were further developed into a book in the 1960s. They postulated in that book that islandized species richness, it depends on island size and its isolation from a source for immigrating species. So they present this equilibrium model based on that concept that when there's an addition of the number of species on an island, the island's immigration rate of new species is going to decrease while the extinction rate of resident species will increase. They assume that there will be equilibrium, that there will be an equilibrium point where the immigration rate equals the extinction rate. And then they further hypothesize that an increase in island size will lower extinction curves, while a decrease in the distance between the island and the source will raise immigration curves. And it is at the intersection of immigration and extinction that really determines the species number. So if you sit with this graph for a little while, it kind of becomes clear that in summary, what they postulated was that small islands that are far away from a mainland source that provides a source of species immigrating to that, let's say, new island are going to have the fewest species. So small far islands have the fewest species, where large near islands are going to have the most, and that the other two intersections fall somewhere in between that. And Wilson actually went on to work experimentally with a grad student, a guy named Daniel Simberloff, to demonstrate this theory in the Florida Keys. He worked with small mangrove islands that they fumigated, and then actually showed that these relationships between immigration and establishment on the island and their distance from source areas held true. So I am gonna, all right guys, I'm picking this back up and continuing with this discussion about the European versus the American view of landscape ecology. And I liked this figure that's in your book that sort of summarizes the influences on the two disciplines that in the European version, human geography and functional ecology, led to this concept of landscape ecology, but that it was more based on human applied in the realm of human land use policy, sociology, political science, resource economics, and planning, landscape architecture. And then in the North American view, where we see landscape ecology applied is more in the realm of modeling, GIS, and resource management. So just super interesting that the two distinct views have held through these years, but more and more I think we see a convergence of the two. So the European perspective was built on a few principles. The idea that landscapes contribute to the formation of local cultures and is a basic component of European natural and cultural heritage, contributing to human well-being and European identity. This is actually some of these principles in recent years, have actually seen more and more of this kind of moving into some of the North American ideals as well. Landscape's an important part of quality of life for people everywhere. A landscape is a key element of individual and social well-being, and its protection, management, and planning entail rights and responsibilities for everyone. So in my view, implicit in the European view is less of an intrinsic value of natural systems and more how natural systems contribute to human well-being. So a little bit of a natural resources as a human commodity perspective. In the North American perspective, we saw again the influence of that first gathering of folks that were ecosystem ecologists and geographers in North America. We see that that founder effect really has persisted today. So in North American perspective, some of the principles we see are that heterogeneity influences the flux of organisms, materials, and energy across the landscape, that formative processes, both past and present, give rise to patterns in the landscape. Heterogeneity affects the spread of disturbance, such as fire, across the landscape, and that natural resource management can be enhanced by adopting landscape ecological approach. So again, the definition that we're working with is the study between spatial, pattern, and process that is not restricted by a particular scale. This is another blurb from your book that I won't read to you, but essentially says what I just said, that more and more we see that the European and the North American view, although they may have evolved separately, that they are complementary, and more we see those two coming together. So this nice Venn diagram sort of summarizes the major influences on landscape ecology: social sciences, ecology and evolution, and geography coming together to help define the scope of this discipline. The book lays out three primary attributes of landscape ecology in North America: landscape structure, that pertains to diversity and spatial arrangement of landscape elements; landscape function, that refers to the interaction among these spatial scales; and landscape change. It refers to how landscape structure and function can vary over time, and the fact that they are infinitely dynamic. And so we're going to go through just a few of these sort of prevailing principles of landscape ecology as well that your book also touches on. And again, a lot of this next part of the lecture I did pull directly from the text, so you can cover this when you read this as well. So landscapes are heterogeneous. So by definitions, landscapes are mosaics of different landforms, ecosystems, habitat types, and land uses Heterogeneity can vary continuously over the landscape, and as it does along an ecocline or an ecological gradient. Elements of the landscape mosaic, the collection of the different land covers and land use types that we see in a given area, are likely to vary in quality and suitability for different species. Landscapes are diverse in form and function, so we often characterize landscapes based on a diverse array of features. So geomorphology, the primary land cover or land use type. So of course we know that the geomorphology of a place often defines and limits the land cover types that we might see there. Specific ecological or biological functions of that place, and the amenities or commodities that they provide for humans. For instance, we might refer to something as a agricultural landscape. Landscapes are scale dependent, and so as I mentioned at the beginning of this lecture, we often think of landscapes as being broad in spatial terms, but there is a persistent movement within landscape ecology to define landscape simply as a spatially heterogeneous area that is scaled relative to the process or the organism of interest. So two species that occur in the same habitat, such as a grasshopper or bison in tall grass prairies in North America, obviously have a very different perception of landscape in terms of the distribution and availability of their preferred forage, given the different scales at which they operate within that system. So this kind of view broadens the definition of landscape and really the domain of landscape ecology. So from this viewpoint, any type of spatial distribution at any scale could be a landscape. And it's really important, I think, this perspective is important because it recognizes that landscape ecology is not simply regional ecology or broad scale ecology, but more of a research paradigm for investigating the effect of spatial pattern on ecological processes at any scale. Landscapes are dynamic. Disturbance across a wide range of scales, from those occurring over a few minutes to those occurring with only a few centimeters, or those operating over tens of millennia across thousands of square kilometers, have a profound influence on landscapes and on the distribution of land forms and habitats across those landscapes. So landscapes are really better viewed as shifting mosaics than as static systems in some sort of equilibrium. And when we think about the dynamic nature of landscapes, it's really good to think about those in terms of both the spatial and the temporal scale. Ecological flows are important, and we know that patch boundaries are often porous to the movement of certain organisms, but they may be impermeable to others, depending on how different organisms perceive the environment and respond to the structure of habitat edges. Flows can occur between ecosystems, such as across land-water interfaces, and asymmetrical flows across patches or system boundaries have obviously a profound effect on dynamics within those, such as between patches or systems within a landscape. connectivity is important. There is a profound sort of preoccupation with the concept of connectivity within landscape ecology. We know that organisms, materials, nutrients, and really processes to varying degrees are dependent upon connectivity in the landscape. Some areas in the landscape are connected, at least functionally, while others are not. And so much of landscape ecology is concerned with measuring and understanding this study of connectivity. And it's profoundly important for so many aspects of it. So we know that connectivity is important for understanding propagation of disturbance across the landscape, the movement and distribution of organisms, materials, nutrients, the structure and dynamic of populations within a species, gene flow, population genetic structure, the spread of invasive species and disease, community patterns and dynamics, and ecosystem structure and function. And my guess is that some of you guys actually are studying some of the dynamics of connectivity and how it affects one of these elements within landscape ecology. Landscapes are multifunctional. This premise is important to keep front of mind. The principal drivers of landscape change are humans, and as landscapes are being transformed and used for a variety of ecological and societal and economic functions, understanding those interactions and even the payoff and how we're valuing landscapes is essential. Landscape management requires a means of identifying and resolving conflicts that arise between these competing interest and value systems. So an example of this today, I frequently work with riverine forested wetlands in the southeastern United States. And when we look at the value of those habitat types and whether or not they're in a mature state or sort of in a constant state of being harvested is of consequence. Many of us might value the economic return in seeing those places stay as working forest, and that has a really important human benefit. But we can also look at the value of those forested wetlands to humans for how they contribute to clean water. And we can also look at the value of those forested wetlands and how they contribute to carbon sequestration. We can look at the value for flood mitigation for downstream communities. We can look at the importance to a variety of species that depend upon them. So really an incredible opportunity to value a single resource in so many different ways and competing sometimes with one another. These are just a few questions that I pulled out at the end of the book that you might want to take the time to reflect upon or summarize. I'm not going to ask you to send in answers to these. When we get to the midterm, I may be pulling from some of these review questions or using them for inspiration for the discussion-based questions that you will have for your exam. So that's it for the first lecture, and look forward to interacting with you guys soon.